Let me welcome everyone, both those who are physically present here with us at University College, and of course, everyone who is attending online. In welcoming you all, I first acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the lands where we live. We are honored to be on the ancestral lands of our First Nations, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. And we look forward to the day when Australia will formally recognize them and extend them the justice so long overdue. Well, we are working towards a fairly tight schedule, so we'll just have to keep running, so to speak, but hopefully plenty of time for reflection and time for questions and conversation. We begin with, first of all, a presentation from me, a little bit of Q&A if there is time, and then we will move gradually into our conversation groups. And that'll be the first part of the afternoon, prior to an afternoon tea break, and then we'll have our two guests who will be discussing with us Australia-China relations. Okay, so the proposition I'm going to put to you over the next half hours, at the most, I hope, give or take, the lucky country has just about run out of luck. But that doesn't mean we're doomed, far from it. We still have the opportunity to achieve great things, but no longer relying on luck. Increasingly, we will need to rely on wisdom, skill, and an awful lot of hard work. So they're the three things we need to get into in a big way: wisdom, skill, and hard work. Very, very hard work. Otherwise, not a very pleasant future. So let me begin by presenting to you a very, very brief, superficial scorecard on three of the key issues we'll be looking at. And the first one is inequality in Australia, which will go up shortly. Well, here it is, and you can see that inequality in Australia is pretty stark. I hope everyone can see what's coming up on the screen. The highest 10%, meaning the richest 10% in Australia, control nearly half of Australia's wealth, whereas the bottom 60% have only access to 17% of Australia's wealth. We have 130 billionaires in Australia at this time, who between them hold an average, each of them, of 3.6 billion. And we know, as we all know, home ownership, especially for the younger generation, has fallen sharply in the last 10 years. The result is that every night, on average, in Australia, tonight and future nights, 116,000 go homeless. And of these, 60% are under 35, and you can see the others, 20% Indigenous, and the Indigenous are only 2% of Australia's population. And if we look at the next slide, we can see how the gains made after the Great Depression over the last 40 years are about all to be lost. The sharp increase in inequality of income shown by the top 10% and then the bottom 15%. The bottom 15% and the top 10%. And if we move to the next slide, which is climate change. Some may take a little bit of comfort, I hope not too much, from the current government's initiatives, which are summarized there. But the fact remains that Australia produces 7% of the world's fossil fuel exports, and no signal that that's about to change, none. No clamp on new projects. There are 114 coal and gas projects in the investment pipeline in this country. And one of them, the Scarborough gas project in WA, it is hard to comprehend, will burn enough fuel to release a volume of emissions equivalent to 20,000 flights around the world every day for the next 25 years. That is Labor's contribution to climate change. It cannot be questioned. I can assure you the facts are correct, at least as of a week or so ago. And if we go to the next one, I think this one would be fairly familiar to people, the life prospects of our Indigenous nations, peoples. I think they're pretty well known to all of you. I won't dwell on it. And of course, there are other issues which are just as important, which also command attention. The next one. The first, public health in the age of pandemics. A simple question to keep in mind: how well prepared are we for the next pandemic, which is coming our way almost certainly within the next 10 years, and probably sooner. And if not the next pandemic, certainly the next variant of the one we've just experienced. No, I think we've missed one. Other issues, which is 6. That's the one. Okay, public health I've just mentioned. The future of multiculturalism in this country remains an open question. I will come back to it later. Sharpening conflicts in Europe and Asia, in which Australia may well be directly or indirectly a participant, and sharply rising mistrust or distrust in Australia towards our major institutions, media, business, government. These are the percentages of people who say in Australia that they believe these percentages, believe that those in charge of those institutions are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know to be false or gross exaggerations. It may be right, it may not be right, but that's what people think. Not a very good place to be. Now, of course, amidst these challenges, we can see now some early welcome signs. It's not all gloom. There is rising public consciousness around key issues: climate change, justice for Indigenous people, the right of... Slide 7. No. You've gone way past. Sorry. No. Earlier. Now, after 6, let's have a look. Yes, after this one, a time of reckoning. We're done. Oh, stop. I don't know what's happened there. Never mind. Okay. So, no, we don't want this current one, so we'll just take it out for a moment. Just a blank will do. Thanks, Ben. So amidst these challenges, I was saying there's rising public consciousness around key issues: climate change, justice for Indigenous people, plight of the homeless. We're getting a lot of letters in media pointing to this issue. There's the Uluru Statement of the Heart and the reception it's receiving, greater representation in the Parliament of those who share these concerns, and the democratizing processes which have made this possible. The rise of independence in particular, and the revisiting, which is now starting, of the Republic debate. These are welcome signs. There is one other thing. We're now seeing the growing, but from a very low base, the growing reach and visibility of small independent media. The Saturday paper, the New Daily, Pearls and Irritations, Crikey, Ticker News, Discernible. So, over the coming decade, Australians will need to take stock of what are best described as the barren years. Certainly the last 20 and possibly longer. There are now issues we can no longer ignore. Many of them have been mentioned. Justice for our First Nations, climate change, deepening economic inequality, public health, etc. And the future of multiculturalism. It is not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. The future of multiculturalism in a society where within 10 years, close to 55% of all Australians will be born overseas or have at least one parent not born overseas, 55%. Close to 1.5 million will speak Mandarin or Cantonese at home. And well over 1 million will be adherents of Islam, with much higher levels of practice than most of the other religions, of course, including Christianity. And as I've mentioned, the sharpening conflicts of in Europe and Asia. So the time of reckoning is with us. You can't ignore that fact. Under successive governments, many of these issues we've been mentioning have been shelved or allowed to simmer. Mounting pressures are now bringing them to the boil. And so it is time for a comprehensive review, not just of policies, which is what a lot of people like doing. Of course, review of policies, but also of institutions, of decision-making processes, of the Constitution, of mindsets, of ways of looking at ourselves and the world. All this needs to undergo transformational change. And all of these, though they may seem political, are first and foremost ethical questions. They go to the heart of ethics. And these together call for a wide-ranging national conversation. This would be a conversation that leads us to a new understanding of what is meant by governance and citizenship. A conversation that takes account of the country's radically different circumstances, demographic, as I've just mentioned, cultural, economic, and international. Now, if we lived in an ideal world, we would look to government to spearhead such a conversation, to establish perhaps a representative and popularly elected national convention. This is not the world in which we live. There is no prospect of a government, at least for now, doing any such thing. Parliaments and political parties, and especially the two major ones, will not be forthcoming. As presently constituted, major parties, and therefore the Parliament to a large extent, are reactive creatures. They are not agents of change. Does this need to prevent or delay the national conversation? Not at all. It is civil society that can itself take the initiative, set in train a national conversation which would involve community organizations, first and foremost, those that are working around issues of poverty, disadvantage, inequality, Indigenous rights, racism, environment, human rights, aid and development, to name a few. All have much to gain and contribute to, much to gain from and contribute to a national consultation, a national conversation. But they must do it together. Each of these organizations and movements beavering away on their individual issues is nowhere near good enough. Transformation of mindset. You can't just be beavering away on climate change or relations with China or homelessness, unaware and unconnected with all those others who are working around these other issues. There has to be a holistic approach involving holistic understanding and collaborative action. And we need to involve as well, may as well mention them, trade unions, a shadow of what they used to be, but still playing a role, professional associations, business groups, student bodies, philanthropic organizations, ethnic community and religious organizations, human-centered research centers and think tanks, and sympathetic media. You see that I've put human-centered research centers and think tanks and sympathetic media. I think we're ready for the next slide. It's called National Declaration of Principles. I think, Ben, you were about to show it a little while ago, just a little while ago. Okay. Because we are dealing with large and pressing ethical issues, I can't drum this enough. So when people say, I can't be bothered with politics, the answer is very clear. I don't want to bother you with politics, just ethics, just morality. Is that of interest? Morality. How we should relate to one another as human beings, individually, personally, and collectively. Interested in ethics, morality. So because we're dealing with these large ethical issues, the national conversation would gain much if it were focused on framing a national declaration of principles. Of course, there are ethical principles that encapsulate Australia's vision of what is a good society and what its proper place in the world should be. And here I'm bringing to your attention a few key principles. The first, right to self-determination of our First Nations. Of course, we need formal recognition of this right, by virtue of which First Nations may freely determine their preferred political status and freely pursue their economic, social, cultural, and spiritual development. Now, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was the result of extensive deliberation among representatives of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, is the necessary starting point towards, as we've heard, an Indigenous voice to Parliament, to truth-telling, and to a treaty. But I'm going to put it to you, we can and must take it one large step further. Just in case you thought that was enough. One step further. We must recognize as a nation Indigenous customs, law, and institution as integral to Australia's living cultural and legal heritage now. Not just a museum piece from the past, as part of the national wisdom. And it is this wisdom which can help us to redefine our relationship with the ecology of this land, which can assist us to develop a new concept of country. We need our First Nations at the end of the day more than they need us. We desperately need their wisdom, integrated into all our institutions. That's the aim, the objective. Respect to the balance, integrity and diversity of the natural environment. Well, we know, I think, this principle quite well, or should, and it needs to inform lifestyles, consumption patterns, and industrial and agricultural practices. We need to be aware that economies, including our own, cannot grow indiscriminately. There need to be, in certain areas, quantitative limits, and these are essential for qualitative improvements. We may need to have quantitative limits on what can grow in economic terms for qualitative improvements in the natural environment and the quality of human life. Redressing inequalities in society, which is the next one. Inequality is toxic. It is ethically toxic, but it's also practically toxic because it tends to limit human fulfillment at the personal level, and it tends to generate conflict between groups at the collective level. And both types of inequality, as experienced by persons individually and groups, restrict the health of persons, of communities, and societies. Whereas greater equality supports essential public goods, better nutrition, better health, physical and mental, better education, less crime, greater civic engagement. In fact, greater equality holds the key to a higher level of ethical awareness and decision-making. If you want ethics in your society, you need to have greater levels of equality, much greater than what we have now. And of course, this is true of other societies as well. Of course, we also need democratic governance, which we don't have. We need to affirm key principles, as, for example, would be spelled out in national declarations we've discussed. We've seen a certain amount of bubbling going on, which to some extent explains the rise of independence and the voices. But this is just a small first step. We must develop adequate processes of deliberation, reflection, consultation, accountability, transparency, and decision-making to which all citizens have ready access. It's up to them then to decide how much advantage they want to get out of this access, but the access has to be there. And for which, therefore, we need diverse quality media, independent of powerful interests, that span a wide range of viewpoints, whose sources of information are transparent, and that enable citizens who wish to speak truth to power. Otherwise, what are the media there for, if not for those things? It wouldn't be for profit purposes, would it? Multicultural Australia. We know that we have a cultural melting pot, a unique space within which one can consider new ways of understanding citizenship. In multicultural Australia, there's much to gain from sharing the values that unite us, and the "and" is often missed out. And the rich insights, aspirations, know-how that come with different cultures, different traditions, different faiths and languages that make up today's Australia. So we have to establish the principle that acknowledges that in the dialogue and affirmation of cultures lies the key to harnessing Australia's irreplaceable asset, its cultural diversity. And a new conception of world order, which understands that Australia's most effective way forward is one that is premised on the primacy of the international common good. That is to say, what we want done within Australia is something that we should aspire to for the whole world. And therefore, a commitment to international institutions, both legal and in all the other areas, effectively serving that end, and Australia fully committed to that. Because that is the best guarantee of a secure world, of a peaceful world, which means that security requires, amongst other things, the prohibition of the development, acquisition, use, or threatened use of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Australia, of course, far away from doing any such thing right now. And a policy of cooperative relations, especially with our neighbours, in line with the principles I've just named. This is not an exhaustive list of, list of principles, but it does build on the socially progressive and democratic strands that coloured Australia in the late 19th and early 20th century, a period when Australia was regarded as a standard bearer in progressive social legislation and democratizing processes. Not so, of course, in the last several decades. So the question is, can Australia reach a consensus on these broad principles? What I'm saying to you is, it would be highly desirable if it could, and it is certainly worth trying. Now, time is running out, so I'm going to just summarize in 2 or 3, 4 minutes. Next slide, Ben, please. Of course, we need to do more. We need to establish a charter or Bill of Rights. The strong case exists for enshrining the rights of Australian citizens in the country's constitution. The best legal minds of the country have advocated it repeatedly, but their advocacy so far has fallen on deaf ears. Such a charter or Bill of Rights would greatly strengthen the democratic process. It would give legal effect to many of the international human rights treaties which Australia has signed, ratified, but observed as much in the breach as in practice. And obviously, this Charter or Bill of Rights would address the rights of a whole lot of different groups in the community: women, children, the LGBTQ communities, workers, including the right to strike, the rights of legal equality, political participation, and the rights to material well-being. including socially useful work, housing, healthcare, education, and a safe environment. And then we need to think about political institutions over and above the Charter and the Declaration of Principles. Next slide. The Republic. It's obvious enough, but not terribly well understood, even by its proponents. The aim must be to sever the residual legal and political links to the British Crown, to the monarchy, and for a reason, not just because it sounds old hat, because it is a constant reminder that entrenches in this country a colonial and post-colonial mindset. That's what's got to go, the colonial and post-colonial mindset. Australia viewing itself as a European outpost, surrounded by a sea of color, with the idea that protection can only come from far apart, whereas our enemies, actual or potential, are all nearby, just looking at Australia with envy to invade it or take advantage of it. That mindset has to go. It can only go as a first step with the severing of links to the Crown, and there's a long way to go. We just need to remember the fortnight saturation coverage of the Queen's passing. Institutions totally committed to maintaining that link at all costs, because it serves them well, though it may not serve the people terribly well. And there is much room for creative thinking. If there is to be a leader of a republic, a ceremonial office, it needn't be just one person. It can be a team. And wouldn't it be extraordinary development in Australia's journey if the team had a representative from our First Nations, from European settlers, and from more recent non-Western settlers, working as a team whose main objective would be to affirm, strengthen, and encourage the Declaration of Principles, an ethical position, nothing to do with everyday politics. Of course, there's much more to do. I haven't got time to do it. At leisure, you will be able to perhaps see the slides, and even, if anyone's interested, the full presentation that I'm giving you. But I think one of the most important areas will be the establishment of citizen councils right across the country, empowered and funded not to make decisions for the country, at least not for a long time, but to air complaints, to hold public inquiries, to investigate facets of public administration, and to issue reports and recommendations, all of it publicly funded. Okay. Of course, we need to attend to our economic institutions. There are numerous proposals, I don't have time to go into it, which would attempt in a fairly substantial way to deal with issues of inequality and institute redistributive mechanisms of various kinds. And finally, yes, next slide, please, Ben. Oh, no, hold it. I don't know what the previous one has. Never mind. The international is terribly important. Too many Australians do not understand as of now that every facet of life in Australia is shaped to a greater or lesser extent by what is happening internationally. How can anyone not understand that when you go to refill your petrol tank, what you are doing is a direct consequence of international arrangements, some of which are not very good. When you buy anything from the supermarket, it's the result of international trade. When you are working, more than likely you are dealing with, whether in education, increasingly even in health, and many other areas, you are dealing with trade, finance, with pressures that emanate from our international relationships. So the international can no longer be neglected. And therefore, it is very important to expect of government that they will support the work of the NGO community that is working on all those different issues that pertain to Australia's relations with the outside world. There's a lot more to be said, don't have to say it, but one point needs to be mentioned. It's in the interests of small and middle-sized nations like Australia. The supreme interest of the time is to curb the hegemonic ambitions and rivalries of so-called great powers, and as far as practicable, to insulate local and regional conflicts from great power interference. So I'm putting to you that the time has come for the Australian community to think through the implications of this and to make this an integral part of a lively and sustained national conversation. The next 10 to 20 years will offer us a unique opportunity and an incentive to redefine who we are, so that we no longer see ourselves as a colonial outpost, an outdated appendage of imperial power. To put it simply, crudely, we will have to mount an effective national break the habit campaign, except that in this case, it's not smoking, it's addiction to imperial power. And crucial to all this, to nurture, to make the conversation possible, is the renewal of civic education in schools, in universities, in colleges, in continuing education. Okay, the renewal of civic education. I don't have time to go into all of this, but it's crucial, and everyone has a stake in education. Students, teachers, parents, and the community at large. We must all ensure not that there be a small little subject called civics or civic education, but that it permeates the whole ethos of every educational institution, its practice and its vision. So, to conclude, we desperately need a national conversation on the future of Australia, the land, its people, its cultures. It will not cure every ill in the country. It will not satisfy everyone's preferences. But if we prepare it carefully, we resource it, we ensure that the conversation is affirming and inclusive, it may still allow Australia to awake from its present slumber. I cannot see a more urgent task than this for all Australians, individually and collectively. And I'm afraid to say, time is of the essence. That's enough from me. A few minutes of Q&A, but not very much, because we have to break into our conversation groups shortly. A question? And then who is seeing whether anyone wants to raise their hand who are online? Good. Yes.
Joe, you've given us a tremendous range of things to think about in discussion and to work on. And I think in many ways you've pointed the way to some of the solutions. The one that jumped out at me was your advice that we have to find a way for all these social groups, civil society, to work together, not to be beavering away on their own little cause. How do we make that happen? Who spearheads that?
Well, I think where there will need to be in the next year or two, if that's going to at all get off the ground, a calling of meetings, of small conversations, larger meetings, and eventually a national conference to which all are invited. So it may be that once it gathers a bit more steam, conversation with the Crossroads can invite a whole lot of groups to share their ideas and their interest in such an endeavor. But first, we need to disseminate ideas and information about how this might emerge, why people should be interested in it, and what contributions might be possible from so many different sources. Anyone online? Not yet. The online, there is one apparently. Stuart Rees. Stuart? Oh.
You're muted. You're muted, Stuart.
Oh. Okay. One other? Anybody else?
We had Eric as well from online.
Yes, I
can't
would
see
make a very brief comment to what you said about the information we get, that it's in part false or gross exaggerations. My impression is, first of all, that it's not so much that the information is false. It can be absolutely true, but it's only a very small part of the truth. The fact is that we're getting a very, very biased, a very one-sided view of what's actually going on in the world. And that's what I think is more important than that the information is true. We have freedom of information. We're free to inform, but that means also we're free to withhold information. That's my comment.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll take it as a comment. There's a lot of wisdom in what you've said, I think. I'm sorry? Yes, please. Is there... Marion? Oh, there we are.
Yes, Joe, while I absolutely agree with most of what you say and your proposals, and it will be wonderful if Australia can, manage to go down this path. However, I somehow thought that the focus was to be more on immediate action that's needed, your call document and the immediate action that's needed to forestall the likely, possible, if not likely, use of nuclear weapons and the galloping, march to war that's happening currently. And of course, it's connected with these things and connected with the, media extreme bias and disinformation that's disseminated, etc. But yeah.
I take your point, but the kind of issue you've just raised, of course, it's urgent. If you're talking about the prospect of a nuclear exchange, which many seasoned commentators are telling us, and I'm of that view as well, is closer now than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, sure, but then how are you going to make that happen? Only a national conversation will lead Australia to want to sign up to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which would be a major breakthrough. We have 110 countries that have close to that have signed the treaty, but together they constitute a small fraction of the world's population and of the world's wealth. The big guns have stayed out, including Australia. So how are you going to turn that around? It only can come about, there is no other way, through a conversation to which more and more people become involved, with which they become involved, and begin to formulate clear-cut demands of the powers that be, and a clear impression given to them that those people are willing to sacrifice a lot to make that happen. You see, there is no value in carrying out a survey of Australians, and they have been carried out, which show that 65 to 70% support Australia signing up to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'm using that as an illustration because you mentioned it. But the powers that be, not just the government, which is just the facade of real power in Australia, the facade, but those behind them, make a judgment that it's entirely feasible to ignore what 65 to 70% because they can't hurt them. See? There's no point saying there is a survey which shows that 65% of Australians, that we have to establish the fact that it means so much to them, assuming that that's the case, that they would be prepared to commit money, time, and energy on an ongoing basis to that objective, this objective, the other objective, the other objective. Otherwise, opinion polls make very little difference until that can be demonstrated. And that can only come about through conversation, through people touching base with each other. That is the urgent task of the moment. It applies to security issues, it applies to climate change, it applies to Indigenous rights of Indigenous people. In that way, the short term and the long term meet. It is that meeting point which provides leverage. And the key to leverage is muscle. And the key to muscle is numbers plus commitment. Numbers plus commitment. Numbers but no commitment, commitment or lots of numbers and no commitment, or commitment only on the part of a few, won't do it. So that's the situation in which we find ourselves, not just here, but in many other parts of the world. And that's why we have to rise to the challenge. It's not pleasant. Pleasant things to say in some people's ear, but I think it is the reality of the situation, at least as I see it. Okay. Any women from here? Lots of men. All right, one more. I don't know who to go for. Yes, Kate. Yes, Cassie.
I just want to bring you to the experience that with the Constitutional Thinking Foundation. It was headed by Sir Ian Stephen in 1991, and this organization was set up actually with the initiation of Paul Keating. Paul Keating wanted to educate the whole nation about system of government and about whether Australia should take to republic or stick to monarchy. And we have a lot of experience throughout the nation actually to educate our schools, our institutions. Now we have a meeting in Town Hall, we have meeting in Canberra, Parliament House, and all that. And I think that experience is quite very valuable that we can actually try to learn from that. And we actually produce, I'm one of the committee from Victoria, we actually produce a report we're supposed to send to all households, Australian households, for them to decide whether we should choose during the referendum to vote for a republic or retain the monarchy. That was an independent report, and we still in Seoul somewhere on the university. And so I think but the way they actually go about, we learn a lot. Especially they also talk about promoting citizenship. Now, promoting citizenship is what we're talking about. Citizen council, which is to educate citizens of all races, whatever we have in Australia, how to behave like a good citizen. So, you know, I think that
Of course.
And
yes,
you probably know some.
Yes, no. There are very rich experiences like the one you've mentioned, and we must build on those. We have to recreate them if they're not operative at the moment, and give a new lease of life to them. I agree.
And if we can get the support of the current government, it would be good. Because actually John Howard, unfortunately, defeated 4 people and it stopped us from moving in this direction. It actually stopped the distribution of that report for all households of Australia.
Thank you. We have to stop because I'd like the conversation groups to get underway. Now, if Ben, I know you'll be keeping you busy and I apologize, but if we go to what I would like the conversation groups, this is a bit of a trial, initial, but a lot more of this can happen in months to come, to be an exercise in active listening. So I want to just give you a couple of pointers, 2 or 3 pointers. Let's do it in 2 or 3 minutes. Because the pointers really reinforce each other. Once we've understood them, we can begin to see whether we can practice them. Okay, I'll start. Conversation is not manipulation, it's not monologue, it's not debate. We're not scoring points. It's conversation is an endeavor, a common endeavor, in this case, groups of 6 or thereabouts, to get closer to the truth of the issue we're discussing. That's the first point. Next slide, Ben. And conversation is a two-way street. Very important that we keep this in mind. The conversation is not just about me. It is also about the other person. We have to strike a balance between speaking and listening. But listening, if I can go to the next slide, is not hearing the words that the other person on the table uttered. It is not hearing the words. Of course, you have to hear the words, otherwise you can't listen actively. It is understanding what the other person is saying and getting an inkling, at least, of why they're saying it. Why is this person saying this? Where's it coming from? When something's not clear from what someone has said, this is a good moment to ask a question, to get clarification. Next. So, of course, in conversation, one is friendly, one is polite. One is trying in conversation to build a rapport between those who are engaged in it. We want to respond to what the other person is saying. In active listening, and this is what I am inviting you to do for the next 25 minutes or so, you can't switch off. You cannot switch off. You can't say this person's boring me. You cannot. You cannot. You can't be thinking, now what am I going to say next? What is the impactful thing that I'm about to say that I should say? No, because you're listening to what the other is saying. There is no time or room to be thinking, what must I now say? And certainly not, what can I say that will show how knowledgeable, clever, or articulate I am? Taboo. Taboo in active listening. So the focus is on the other person. Next slide, Ben. When a conversation is flowing well, it moves naturally from one person to the other, all good. However, there are times when the conversation is a little stilted. It's not flowing. And then it is up to a facilitator or any member of the group to help things along by giving a signal that gives encouragement to someone else in the group. And the signal can be given by words, but it can also be given by body language. In active listening, body language is terribly important. Someone speaking here, we don't do that. We're looking at the person. We're looking intently. We're looking at the body language to see whether they're concerned, upset, joyful, or whatever. It's all part of understanding what is being said. Finally, attentive listening enables me to ask the right question. When we ask questions, we avoid, sometimes it's not possible, but where possible, we avoid a question to which the answer is a straight yes or no, because that tends to corner the person to having to say yes, no, and there may be shades of gray. Rather, it's useful to ask how and why questions rather than yes, no answers, questions that lead to yes, no answers. So, and if someone is saying something which may not be of particular interest to you, it may be worth taking a minute to show that you have some interest in what is being said, even though it is not your high priority. Active listening. Without active listening, no conversation is possible. No fruitful or productive conversation is possible. The national consultation I was talking about would come down, crumbling down into a wasteland. Democratic processes require active listening, not just intellectually, but emotionally. It needs to be an emotional connection or encounter. Of course, we can't do that in 25 minutes. We can have a little go. So, now, some of you may be interested we've got 4 options, okay? One is you want to come at what the presentation was putting to you, but want to come at it from a climate change perspective. Well, you go to the climate change table. If you want to do it from an inequality perspective, there are 2 tables. Go to one of those, if you're not already sitting there. If you want to do it from justice for Indigenous people, you do it at that table. If you want to do it holistically, if you want to do it over in this kind of overview that spurred me to make this particular presentation, well, you go to an agenda for comprehensive reform, which there may be, there is one, and we could have 2. So, question to you: a straw vote. Won't count for a lot, just a straw vote. How many of you would like to be part of a conversation which deals with the overall question of transformation, cultural, social, political, and the agenda that comes from that? How many of you are roughly covering the kind of area I was interested in? Well, that looks like 2 groups. So that settles it. We should have then 2 groups dealing with that, and 2 for inequality and 1 each for climate change and justice for Indigenous people. So please go to your tables. There is a facilitator at each table, and best of luck. And then we'll have a well-earned afternoon tea break. So we're now about to break up into breakout groups online as well.
Yeah, so.
Wow. Did anybody? Hello, can I be reconnected to meeting room 1, please? Hello? Hello? Hello?
For the next Q&A, that's people have already come up. There's a couple of comments and questions online.
recorded.
Outside. I can't see. I beg pardon?
Your camera thing is not working.
Have the camera off. I have to see them. David, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Joe, I can.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. They're just finishing their afternoon tea break and they'll be with us within a minute or so.
Fantastic.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Not at all.
How are you?
Very well, thanks.
How's Sydney University treating you?
Well, we took 2 days of strike action last week, so I suppose I have a few complaints, but
How did that go?
quite successful. Quite successful. We're quite good at stopping business as usual when it's necessary at Sydney. So,
And the powers that be are listening?
there's been a little bit of movement in the last few weeks, and we're hoping for more before the end of semester. So fingers crossed.
That's good. Now I'm just looking to see whether.
What was the strike about, David?
Hello, how are you? Hong, are you there?
Hi, Joe.
Hello,
It's good to
how
see
are
you again. Yeah.
You keeping
Yeah, very
well?
good, very good, very good. Yeah, very good.
张红你好。
你好，你好。
How
Good to
is
see you.
ECNU these days?
We're sort of there have been some kind of a patchy outbreak of the COVID-19, so we're returning to online teaching again.
Okay.
2 weeks. So next week it will be online, and but generally speaking, things are normal. Teaching, researching, everything is still going on. We sort of like thinking, online teaching and online working is now the new normal. Just a part of the possibilities that we might come across.
And how's the Australian Studies Centre?
The center is going on. We're having classes. Miyu and I, we share between us 5 classes of Australian studies. And yeah, and we have got new recruits, new teachers and new postgraduates, PhD students who are studying and learning about aspects of Australia.
So you're busy.
Yes.
Very busy.
Yes. But regretfully, of course, we cannot resume the cross-country travel. So we look forward to possibility to a prospect, possibly next year, that we might be welcoming you from Australia to be with us this year. Next month, there will be the 18th conference of Australian Studies in China. So Shanghai, the annual Australian Studies Conference, which will be held in Shanghai.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully next year for next year's conference, we'll be able to welcome you to come to China to join us.
I would very much like to do that. I haven't been for a few years now.
Yeah.
We're just about ready to go in 1 more minute. People always drag their feet when they have their afternoon tea break.
How many do you have there in the room, Joe?
Just a bit under 40. Then the people online. But they've been at it since 2 o'clock.
All right.
And we'll keep them till 5. All right. Well, I think we're just about ready to go. If I could have everyone's attention, we're now going to turn our minds to Australia-China relations. Perhaps if we could bring some of the stragglers. Thank you. Our 2 guests have been waiting for a while, so we shouldn't delay it any longer, and I apologize for a little delay. People are now refreshed, so you should have had a recovery of attention span. This is a very important issue. There could hardly be a more important issue currently confronting Australia's relations with the outside world. We touched on this just briefly earlier on, but we didn't really go into it. For those of you who attended the previous 7-week series, of course, we did discuss China, but we didn't discuss it with a view to Australia-China relations. And it has become, at the political level, the government level, a fraught relationship, which is one of the saddest things one can imagine in terms of Australia. So we've asked our 2 guests to share with us a few reflections on how they see relations, how they have developed, and perhaps how they might develop. So we have the 2 guests are David Brophy, Dr. David Brophy from Sydney University. He's a senior lecturer, he's a historian, but with a strong interest in China and highly involved in the affairs of the university, which universities around Australia need an awful lot of attention at this time. So it's good to have someone who thinks a lot and acts in relation to the way universities go about their business, their educational objectives. And then we have Professor Chen Hong. I've known him for quite a long time. It's a great pleasure to see him. He has a very strong connection with my university, La Trobe University. if I remember rightly, I think he got his PhD from La Trobe University, and is one of China's best ambassadors for Australia. He is Professor of English at this China Normal University and heads the Australian Studies Centre at that university, and has president of the Federation of Australian Study Centres across China, of which I think there are perhaps 38, 37. If I'm wrong, I'll be corrected. And there are more, to my knowledge, such centres, Australian study centres in China than in any other country. So it's a great pleasure to have you both. I'm going to ask David to share some thoughts, reflections on the relationship, and then I'll pass on to our other guest. And after that, we'll have a little conversation and then open it up to questions from participants who are here physically present, as well as those who are attending online. So David, would you like to start things off?
Certainly. Thank you very much, Joe, for the invitation and the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all this Sunday. If we talk about China, there's a million things that we might talk about. China impinges on many policy questions these days in Australia, and often even when it's not connected, it's invoked in some way. I thought just for the 10 minutes that I have, I'll start from first principles and lay out the big picture as I see it. Then we can get into some of the nitty gritty in the discussion. Now, there's more to global politics than the calculations of national strength, but fluctuations in the wealth, influence, and power of different countries is an inherent part of the capitalist system that we live in. China knows that well. It ended up on the losing side of what we call the Great Divergence, when Europe and Britain in particular shot ahead of any potential competitors. As a result of that divergence, by the mid to late 19th century, national elites all around the world recognized a need to catch up, to mimic, to adopt techniques of industrial capitalism. Now, certain countries that were not early adopters, like Germany, were able to affect that change in a top-down fashion. Japan, a victim of some of the same kind of indirect colonialism that China was experiencing, succeeded in doing likewise. But for China's last dynasty, the Qing, that challenge proved too much. That condemned China to decades more of internal and external conflicts, a lot of human suffering, and left it with only a revolutionary path to re-establish itself as a viable, independent unit in the global system. That national mission, what they called self-strengthening, is what I see as primarily driving the Chinese Communist Party to victory in 1949. But that event, of course, was part of a global anti-colonial upsurge, something that was highly disruptive to the global order at that time. And from a Western point of view, all of this was something that needed to be contained. Now, much more could be said about that, of course, but to cut a long story short, it was contained. The network of Cold War alliances that America built at the end of the Second World War held. Insurgencies and communist movements in Southeast Asia were suppressed. And from the 1970s onwards, China itself was gradually brought into the fold. And we entered the period known as engagement. But while the China challenge in its revolutionary mode, we can say was met, the deeper challenge that China's sheer size and pace of growth would one day again disrupt American primacy in Asia has now clearly presented itself. And what we've witnessed in the last half decade or so is the pendulum swing back from engagement to containment. There are many signs of that we might point to, but it is, I think, relatively uncontroversial now that Joe Biden has made it a matter of American policy to slow China's growth. And the most recent step in that direction, just in the last few days, has been a series of sanctions and export controls on China's high-tech semiconductor industry, which even very pro-US commentators have described as an effort to effectively kill off that industry in China. All of this was done without any pretense of security justification. So where is Australia sitting in all this? I suppose that's more the topic for today's discussion. Australia has historically exhibited this similar mix of xenophobia and xenophilia that you will find in a lot of Western countries, probably though with more intense extremes of both, given Australia's proximity to China. The business community has traditionally been quite bullish on China, while the foreign policy and security establishment has been more wary, if not paranoid. And these are both constituencies that have a privileged role in shaping foreign policy. So their views tend to structure the debate. There was, I would argue, a tense equilibrium between these two opposing viewpoints that held up until 2017 or so. And in the book I published last year, China Panic, I try to chart how that equilibrium fell apart. Now, I argue against the popular view that Australia's shift on China was simply a case of following the US. Australian foreign policy elites have their own mind. They've tended to agree, though, that Australia's interests, as they define them, are best served by ensuring the presence of a friendly, dominant power in the region, be that Britain or now the United States. So historically, Australia has often had a role in lobbying these outside powers to increase their commitments. And I think we saw some of that going on in the wake of the Trump election in 2016, which, if you remember, was initially believed to signal a turn away from the Asian and European alliance systems. And it was in that context that Malcolm Turnbull was persuaded to adopt proactive measures to shift Australia towards a more confrontational stance on China, essentially in the hope of stiffening American resolve. For me, that helps explain why Australia was so vocal in this shift, in advertising its new anti-China policies globally. And the showpiece among those policies being the foreign interference legislation, which I'd be happy to talk more about if anyone's interested. So the hype and sensationalism that got going at this time was part of the policy, not just a byproduct of the policy. And one very unfortunate consequence of that, combined with the COVID pandemic, was, of course, a rise in anti-Chinese racism. Now, I think we can say that by the middle of the Trump administration, it was obvious that some of that anxiety was misplaced, that Trump or people in his administration had identified China as an enemy. They were adopting policies to confront it, policies that Biden has mostly carried on. So in that situation, there's actually a certain amount of space for Australia to step back, to not be quite as provocative as it has been. And I think that's the space that the ALP has taken up now with its fairly ambiguous call to stabilize the relationship. Now, security hawks will interpret that as saying that they want to consolidate the new normal. Those hoping for a change in policy will see stabilizing the relationship as a form of improving the relationship. Let me just add a couple of points and then I'll wrap up. So my own view on this situation is really not premised on any particular notion of what Australia-China relations should look like. But what I would like to convince people of is that Australia has played an active part in fostering a climate of international tensions that is not in the interests of ordinary Australians, and that we do therefore need to play a part in critiquing and correcting that stance. As I've said, I think this is not just driven by subservience to the US, but by Australia's own historical sense of itself as an imperial actor in its own right. Now, the implication there is that whether or not the US stays in the game, some of those ambitions, for example, Australia's desire to keep China out of the Pacific, will remain a potential source of conflict. Now, the second point I just want to add before I close, is that a critique of the direction of politics in the West, hopefully this should be obvious, but often it's not, that critique need not entail a rosy view of the direction of politics in China. The barrage of hostile reporting in Australia has indeed required a certain amount of debunking, but that still leaves ample room to remain critical of China's domestic and foreign policies. My own original expertise as a historian is on Xinjiang. It disappoints me to see so often people who want to move from a valid and necessary critique of Western policy to arguing that, in fact, that there's nothing troubling going on in Xinjiang, that the Uyghurs are all happy, and so on. That's far from the case. The issue is, of course, that many people concerned with those domestic political questions in China and who are active outside of China will see benefit in the current turn towards political, economic, and military pressure on China, that this will have some sort of spin-off benefit for the cause of human rights in China. Personally, I don't buy that myself. I think that the more that we move to a war footing in the West, the more Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party will do the same. And the consequences for minorities and other vulnerable groups, not to mention the consequences for world peace and other imperatives, could be potentially dire. Hopefully that'll do by way of opening comments. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. I meant to say in the introduction, but David has mentioned it. He recently published a very interesting and important book, China Panic, and I recommend it to anyone who has interest in Australia-China relations. Well, thank you for all that, David. We'll come back to you, of course, shortly. But let's now turn to Professor Chen Hong and ask him to share his thoughts and reflections on the relations of the two countries. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Joe, for your kind invitation, for inviting me to this event. And also, thank you for your kind introduction about me. After this seminar was promoted in Australia, I received a couple of emails and messages from some dear and old friends in Australia who thought in joy that I would be attending the event in person, physically in Melbourne. So I share that sense of anticipation. Last time I visited Australia was in Sydney in January 2020. So it has been almost 3 years, and I do miss my friends and colleagues in Australia, the air, the beach, and the beers, which I always relish and enjoy so much. Anyway, so I have been looking forward to returning to Melbourne, to Sydney, and other places in Australia, and I hope it won't be too remote a wish. The seminar from the poster, I think has a very interesting topic, which is about the lucky country and its luck. So I read Donald Horne's book many years ago, and I have been, indeed wondering about the role that luck or various factors that have been favorable to nation building and national development has played to make Australia as it is or has been. So various circumstances have been, contributing to Australia's economic well-being, cultural richness, and affluent life for the people. So with my, observation and study, I think Australia's current geopolitical, economic, social, and cultural standing is not merely the outcome of chances, but a confluence of factors, conditions, and forces. Australia won't be such a multicultural society if there had not been the contribution from the indigenous people and the migrants from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, and from the Americas. So recently I wrote a review for a book of history, recounting the Chinese soldiers who were enlisted to participate in the Australian contingents and regiments in Europe during the First World War. And also the most recent example is, of course, the successful and mutually beneficial cooperation and partnership between Australia and China. Australia and China's economic success won't be possible without the comprehensive partnership, which has contributed to China's success to lift millions of people out of poverty, transforming the country into the second largest economy in the world. That partnership has also helped Australia overcome the impacts of the global financial crisis in 2008 and bring billions of dollars to Australia's revenue from its economic and trade relations with China. So it is therefore, I think, extremely saddening when we look at the disastrous downfall of the bilateral relations. In 2016, I was invited by Malcolm Turnbull when he held a big luncheon, in Shanghai. So Malcolm Turnbull brought with him a huge delegation of about 1,000 people to visit China, seeking opportunities of business cooperation and joint ventures. And then in April 2017, China's Premier Li Keqiang visited Australia as part of the annual prime ministerial meeting between the two countries. So Malcolm Turnbull at the time took Premier Li Keqiang to watch an AFL game in Sydney. It was the Sydney Swans versus the Adelaide Powers. Li Keqiang, the Chinese premier, was given the scarves of both clubs, one red and the other, of course, blue, light blue, which Premier Li Keqiang put around his neck at the same time. So he said, I put both scarves on because I always hope for a win-win situation. Such should be the prospects of our bilateral relations as they always have been. And at this remark, Malcolm Turnbull laughed heartily, saying they certainly will be. So you simply can't imagine that the same Malcolm Turnbull just a few months ago, later, pulled his old stunt once again, this time in the parliament in Canberra, speaking in his very awkwardly accent in Mandarin, that all the Australian people are standing up to China. They appeared in suddenness, a kind of barrage of fabrications of Chinese political interference and espionage activities. The media, some so-called Chinese experts, China experts, like Clive Hamilton, and some political figures started to hype up the China threat theory. So is there any truth in that disinformation campaign? As a matter of fact, the Four Corners program, which supposedly exposed Chinese influence and political donation and interference, called Power and Influence. You can't find it on ABC iView or the YouTube, because that episode had been pulled down by ABC, withdrawn by the ABC, because it was full of inaccuracies and lies. And the two business persons of Chinese origin, remember Huang Xiaomo and Chao Chao-wen, both won their lawsuits against the ABC, the SMH, and the Age and Herald Sun for libeling. And 2018 saw Scott Morrison, then still the treasurer, announcing that Australia would impose a blanket ban, a total ban on Huawei, because Huawei was a security threat. Confucius Classroom, which had been in high schools and primary schools in New South Wales teaching Chinese language and culture, they were forced to be closed down because they were a security threat. And the Chinese dairy company submitted an acquisition proposal to buy a milk and beverage business in Australia. That bid was rejected by George Frydenberg because it was a security threat. A kind of scare and smear campaign, I think, was obviously going on in Australia in resonance to the Trump administration's anti-China hysteria. 2020, April, when China and the rest of the world have been engaged in the fight against the global existential enemy, the COVID-19 coronavirus, Scott Morrison and Maurice Payne announced that Australia was initiating an investigation of China for the origin of the virus based on the presumption of guilt. Mind you that Australia was the first country in the world that imposed the total ban on Huawei before the United States. And the Morrison administration did it again in 2020. Morrison started this finger-pointing blame game on China when the COVID-19 pandemic was still rampaging in the world. And Australia was the first in the world to do it. Morrison then telephoned Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, to persuade them to support him. Both Macron and Merkel rejected his proposal. 2021, last year, and we remember, of course, the drums of war, sounded by the Secretary of Home Affairs, Michael Pazuello, and Peter Dutton have been theatrically, describing the prospect of war with China for Australia to get involved should America start war with China. All of a sudden, just within 5 years, China had been, transformed from a partner to become Australia's enemy. When you turn on the television, whenever China appears in the news, you would categorically see the military parade that took place in Beijing in 2019. That was in fact part of the National Day celebrations for the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But those images of the PLA soldiers in that parade, they were repeatedly shown on the screen to create a misconception that China is a militaristic country. So it is no surprise that Lowy Institute's recent poll reported a drastic decline of public opinions of China because China has been so effectively demonized. And another survey run by the Australia Institute showed a hilariously absurd result because 9% Australians, that is to say almost 1 in 10 Australians, believe China would soon invade Australia. Meanwhile, the Australia Institute also did a similar poll in the island of Taiwan, and only 5% of the respondents there believe that the PLA, army will launch a military operation on the island. So late last year, China and the Solomon Islands signed an agreement for police cooperation. That agreement is to strengthen policing capacity of the Solomon Islands to ensure the security, the social order of the island country. However, that agreement has been distorted as something of military intention. So whatever the Chinese and the Solomon Islands governments reiterate, the China hawks in Australia and elsewhere simply make it as an excuse to try to ostracize China from economic and investment cooperation with the island countries in that region. So China has no military intention in South Pacific. However, in March this year, Australia signed a reciprocal access agreement with Japan, which is 1,800 miles from China. That agreement enables Australia to send troops and deploy troops and weapons in Japan. So this antagonism towards China, I think, is obviously very detrimental to the national interests of both China and Australia. Anyone with the presence of mind believes this egregious tendency has to be stopped and reversed. So in recent months, since 21st of May, when Labour won the election, we have been witnessing gradual changes taking place between the two countries. The resumption of the ministerial meetings between the two governments is very important, and the Albanese government has differed from its predecessor, at least in rhetoric, when China comes into the focus. There is ostensibly, more rationality in Canberra instead of the battle cries made by the Morrison administration. And this year, 2022, is the 50th anniversary of our bilateral relations. The establishment of diplomatic relationship was on 21st of December, 1972. So history shows us clearly that, over the past decades, the two countries, China and Australia, are indeed lucky to have each other. And I certainly hope this luck would be cherished and nurtured so that it would persist to the benefits of both countries and peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've both raised a lot of very interesting questions and reflections, and I'll try and engage you two in just a very short conversation about some of the key issues that have arisen from what both of you have been saying. David, if I can turn to you first, you made the interesting point that Australian elites do not necessarily act the way they do in relation to China purely in order to follow the US lead on this issue. But you wouldn't want to take that too far, would you? If, for example, hypothetically, China and the US were to get on reasonably well, how long would Australia be the odd man out and maintain a hostile, at the elite, a hostile relationship towards China? In other words, yes, from time to time, Australia has tended to be more pro-American than the Americans. So, for example, there was a time when we were pushing the United States to do even more in Vietnam. That's true. And maybe there's an element of this here, but really we wouldn't step too far out of line if there was a substantial difference between what the security establishment in the United States is saying and the security establishment in Australia might be saying. Is that an overstatement? What do you think?
I agree with what you've just outlined. And then, I mean, the corollary to my position is not that Australia is capable of going it alone to uphold its position in the region. Well, let me come back to that. But essentially, yes, I mean, I think that Australia has now locked itself into a stance, and we could talk about how much movement there's been the ALP. But I think that the essential strategy here is one that we've seen almost since the days of colonization, to pursue this effort to catalyze a stronger, renewed American presence in the region. It follows then that, you know, I think that Australia will maintain that policy as long as it seems viable. Now, what does it look like to remain viable? Well, you know, as long as America and China are locked in this very intense standoff, then I don't think we'll see any shift in Australia. But certainly some sort of, well, it could go in two directions, couldn't it? I mean, some sort of, you know, violent collapse of this sort of structure of tension that we have, or some sort of grand bargain between Beijing and Washington that would lead to some kind of rearrangement of the chess pieces in the region. Both of those things would necessarily trigger some kind of shift in Australia's position. Now, of course, there's a separate debate about Australia's decision to join in any hot war that develops. Could talk about that as well. The problem that I think needs to be highlighted is that within the strategic policy community, those people who are skeptical of America's stamina and are therefore critical of this doubling down on the American presence from Australia. I'm talking about people like Huawei. They draw certain conclusions from that, including that in order for Australia to influence the region, remain a regional player without someone like the United States backing it up, then Australia will have to become more of a more militarized country. There's this certain recognition within that debate that America actually provides Australia with an ability to play this sub-imperial role on the cheap. So we're sort of caught then between two rather unattractive options, and I think the way out of that is to adopt a more thoroughgoing critique of the nature of international relations. I think that's just essential at this particular point in time. But I mean, this is sort of a long-winded way of me saying that I concur with what you've said there, Joe.
Now, if Hong, if I can turn to you, do you see? Let me put it this way: to what extent has this souring of the relationship at government level between the two countries become a concern inside China? And for example, do your students know at least a little of what you've been telling us? Has the news about the what is now the fraught relationship between the two countries percolated outside simply political leadership? How are things viewed by reasonably knowledgeable and interested people inside China?
Yeah, among the general public, I think there has been a huge degree of perplexity, about the direction that bilateral relations has been going, that is going down, in a deteriorating way. Because never, have people, in China have been thinking about Australia as sort of, confrontational, way, because Australia has always been perceived as a, a country that is affluent, that's easygoing, that is actually in close relationship with China and with the rest of the world. So that has been actually the impression, among students and their parents when they decide to go to Australia to study. And that has been also, in mind when people decide to travel to Australia for tourism and also for, shopping, for, commodities, that are actually of interest to Chinese consumers. But this sudden, kind of hostility on the part of the Australian government, namely the previous, liberal national, government, has been, really, very shocking, confronting, and it is hard to imagine, especially among the students and also the general public, that Australia should certainly be turning in such a way that even, for example, like Japan, like Korea, like other countries in the region, there are, disputes and differences of opinions. Even with Japan and with some other countries, there are some territorial disputes between China and some of those countries. But Japan and other countries, they're not assuming this kind of very, confrontational and antagonistic way towards China. So I think actually this is actually all building up towards this kind of perplexity. So sometimes people talk about, I mean, in Australia, the Morrison governments and some other politicians talk about China, imposing a kind of, economic sanction on China. I think actually that's not completely true. I think the picture, because among the consumers, among the general public, there is now a reluctance, to recognize Australia as some kind of, for example, if you want to buy wine, why don't you choose Chilean wine or South African wine or New Zealand wine? Why Australia? Because all in the news, not only in Chinese news, but also in the international media, that Australia always hostile towards China. So I think that actually is the result of a consumer's choice, not really of a government imposition. That is worrying very much, I think, because there's really, for example, like the COVID-19, travel restrictions, I think actually will be eased in the future, next year, hopefully. So people will be, once again, traveling, going overseas. But then, what about, their favorite destination, one of their favorite destinations, that is Australia. So I think actually I've been telling them actually this is all, for time being, that's not for long, a kind of, temporary, rightist reign, in Australia may not mean, some kind of permanent relationship, but this is certainly, not solving all the, problems and, unlocking all the problems for the people.
One final question from me to you both, and you may wish to interact on this. A change of direction, to me, does not sound as simple as a change of government. And the only realistic prospect right now is from a Liberal-led to a Labor-led government, because the interests that have been pushing Australia towards a more antagonistic position on China are those that sit behind the parties in office. And they haven't gone away. They're still the same people, by and large, very little difference. Whether you're looking at the defense establishment, even the Department of Foreign Affairs, there have been a couple of changes, but the Department of Foreign Affairs is probably second fiddle when it comes to defining security policy in Australia. And what I'm trying to say is, it's not just the language of politicians, it's also actions. We need only think of the AUKUS agreement between the US, UK and Australia, and the submarine deal. Who is that pointed at? The Pacific Islands? The Philippines? Obviously not. They have someone else in mind. The military exercises, the sending of military of naval assets very close to Taiwan, and so on. So the question is, do we have any realistic expectation that with the present government, even though the rhetoric might be toned down, that on these hard questions, there will be a shift? What do you think, David?
Well, I think that there is a more diverse debate on this question inside the Labour Party, and you can always point to critics who've mounted criticisms that go beyond simple questions of tone and rhetoric. But that was where Albanese and his team left things in the lead up to the election. And in certain respects, they quite opportunistically came at the Liberal Party from a hawkish direction on the issue of the Pacific. For example, attacking Morrison as essentially losing the Pacific, to use that Cold War language. Even someone like Penny Wong, in her time in opposition, was just as willing as anyone in the Liberal Party to whip up suspicion towards Australians of Chinese background engaged in the political system. Thinking of the case of Gladys Liu, for example. I think what you like of Gladys Liu, but Penny Wong's charge that we need to question whether she's a fit person to stand in Parliament, that was clearly referring to the constitutional clause about allegiance to a foreign power. That was all part of the mix, and Labor were engaging in this just as much. So look, I'm not optimistic about the direction of things under Labor. I think that AUKUS, the ultimate endpoint of AUKUS with these submarines is not necessarily the primary purpose, I think, of AUKUS. I think it's more to create a framework of ongoing dialogue and lobbying, as sort of allows Australia to get its foot in the door again in Washington to talk more about more short to medium term objectives, like anchoring more of an American military presence in the Northern Territory. And I worry that we're just now living in a time where we're going to see a steady trickle of these announcements coming out. I know there's another AUSMIN meeting later in the year. I think it's entirely possible that there'll be some new step towards, there's a shopping list of things that the security think tanks have been angling for. And I think that basic structure of policy making, as I said, is gonna remain in place. So it sort of leaves me with no alternative but to point to the need for more grassroots opposition. And unfortunately, foreign policy is it's a realm of policy making that is really often, very removed from democratic input. And I think that makes it quite difficult to arouse public sentiment and activism up until the point in which, things actually really hit the fan and you have something like a war to campaign around. But there is an effort underway now to push back against AUKUS. And I think AUKUS is a weak spot in a certain sense, because there is within even very, mainstream commentary, a lot of misgiving and questioning about the wisdom of that particular strategy, and I think that does create an opening for a slightly deeper critique of what underlies that pact. Anyway,
thank you. Hong, do you want to share any thoughts, and also tell us, how do you see the future of university collaboration between the two countries as well?
Yeah, first of all, I think actually about the government's change of the governments. I don't think actually China, we in China actually really have some kind of a partisan preference, because that really, doesn't mean much to us here, because ideological differences between the Liberal and National Party and also the Labour Party, of course, there are, a profusion of the differences, but definitely that's not really, China's concern. What China wants is a constructive, relationship, cooperative partnership with a country that can, really work with China. That is actually their aim. So I think actually China is recognizing the change of governments as an opportunity, a turning points, a possible turning points that may bring some kind of a change. That is actually what I think people in China have been thinking of and hoping. We see that the Chinese ambassador Xiao Jian actually had been expressing the views that actually we hope actually this year, well, the first, of course, the change of government in Australia, and also the 50th anniversary of the bilateral relations, those could all, contribute towards some kind of, change of the directions of the bilateral relations. At least, for Australia, in Canberra, people will be, assuming a less, attitude that is for sure. I think actually I read David's book, The China Panic, in which he pointed out very, insightfully, some of the policies are simply for show, to show that we are different. We are actually confrontational towards China. That is to show the rest of the world, to show Washington. So I think actually this kind of, showy event is not really, constructive to Australia's own well-being and also long-term national interest. That is actually, I think, what we have been thinking about. And as to AUKUS, I think actually this is really causing some kind of alarm here in China, because when Quad is recognized as something that is largely political, geopolitical, a kind of a political, framework, but AUKUS is becoming something that is more military, with some kind of military intention, about submarine. Nuclear power submarine, but with nuclear submarine could easily be transformed into, a nuclear submarine, to carry nuclear, weapons. So all these things actually are really, when I think some military, analysts in Australia were making, analysis about the purpose of Australia to build this fleet of nuclear powered submarines, some analysts were saying that actually that is for the purpose of, for the submarines to travel through the South China Sea, the difficult terrains, submarines, the terrains, and to the island of Taiwan, to engage in a war, with China should America, attack China, over, the Taiwan Straits. So I think actually all those actually are really raising alarms here in China that Australia really is actually making some kind of preparations, at least building this preparedness, for possible, military confrontation with China. So I think this is why I think here in China, people are on one hand very much worried about the future direction that Australia might be taking, towards China. On the other hand, of course, we are still hoping that actually things could be eased, because definitely, for the bilateral relations, this is really of mutual benefits to both countries, not really some kind of a confrontational, strategy, which does no good to both countries. And as for the university level, cooperation, also in the recent years, we've been, recognizing some alarming signs, because they were talking about intellectual property theft, which is largely built upon some kind of fabrications, because when students from China study in America, study in Europe, study in Australia, and then they return to China, to contribute to, the economic and technological developments. That's not theft. That's really, this kind of, global, intellectual, collaboration. So, but on the other hand, really, in the West, when David was also pointing out very pointedly that actually, there's no concealment in the attention that's actually aimed in the Biden and also the previous Trump administration, is to stop and hinder China's development. That is actually the real intention. So I think actually this is really, creating some kind of barriers for the collaboration between, the universities. I think actually in China, the internationalization of education is still, one of the priorities. This morning, in fact, in the midday here, the CPC, China, Communist Party of China's 20th Congress is being held, in Beijing, in which actually there was the speech made by President Xi Jinping, in which he was pointing out the importance of innovation, of technological development. Are all very important for on China's agenda. So I think actually internationalization, education collaboration, these are very important. But if these issues are being politicized and even weaponized, in the United States and then in some other allies and partners, that could be very much worrying, I think.
Okay, thank you. Now, a few questions from our participants. Who would like to ask a question, either online or here, physically with us? One, yes. I'd like a spread of men and women. Any online? Not yet. All right. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, we'll start with an online person because there's a preponderance of people who are here present physically. So, Jim.
Okay, David, thanks for all your expertise. I know that one area of your expertise is the Uyghur autonomous region. And this really is a pivot point in the conversation in Australia around human rights. So, of course, just simply attacking it is not very helpful, but I would really like to get your views on, firstly, what it does represent, and secondly, how it should be discussed in the Australian context.
Those are two quite large questions. There's no doubt in my mind that there's been a big intensification of repression in Xinjiang over the last 5 years, roughly sort of coinciding with the deterioration of China-Australia relations as well. And so it's not surprising that that has been hit upon as moral justification for this turn against China. Now, as is often the case in these international disputes, I mean, it's there's a lot of truth in what is said, just as there's a lot of truth in the kinds of criticisms that China would make of Australia's domestic and foreign policies in this context. What I mean, this has been a lingering issue for the Chinese Communist Party. I think they've come to the conclusion that Xinjiang, in fact, is a more intractable question than even Tibet. And this resort to extremely heavy-handed indoctrination campaigns. And now, I mean, the situation is evolving. Some of the headline-grabbing claims about huge numbers of people in internment camps and so on, I think that that's now a thing of the past, but there's still a lot to be concerned about in people being filtered through the actual criminal justice system. My analysis of this is both a combination of local issues and China's participation in really a global demonization of Muslim minorities in the context of the war on terror. So I don't think it's possible to really grapple with this issue without coming to terms with that wider context. Now, if we just look across the region, Australia has spent 20 years in Afghanistan, ostensibly prosecuting its war on terror to disastrous effect. We have been supporting governments like the Philippines in their own counterinsurgency campaigns, justified in very similar terms with all sorts of human rights atrocities associated with it. Just across the border from Xinjiang in India, you've had Modi send in military occupation into Kashmir, which has elicited hardly a word from Western governments. So we have to remember that, human rights involves principles, and it's not all that useful or interesting to talk about human rights in relation to country X, right? So, well, if people say, well, we need to stand up for human rights towards China, I sort of scratch my head, because if you're just doing it in relation to China, then you're not really doing it at all. You're doing something else. So, I mean, I think people do want to often narrow the conversation down to China. They don't want to hear about Israel, Palestine. They don't want to hear about Kashmir. They don't want to hear about, but I don't think you can do that. I think that Australia needs to start building some consistency and credibility into what it says around human rights, or there's very little good is going to come from you know, prosecuting an argument with China about these things.
Okay, question? Yes, one here. Could you come up so that people online can hear you? Could you come?
David, I'd like to ask you two things. The first thing I want to know is, you said that there is, I gather, within the government, some of the AUKUS agreement. And I wondered where you get that information from, or on what basis you're saying that. The second thing I would like to ask you is, it seems to me that it's not very clear on its attitude to China, because on the one hand, Penny Wong has made an effort to meet the Foreign Minister of China. Miles has made an effort to meet the Defence Minister of China. And yet the Australian ambassador in America has actually very explicitly said, we are preparing for a war with China. And if you look at the submarines issue, and you go into it in some detail, and AUKUS, it all points to me to possibly engaging in a war with China. So I'm just wondering, how do you see that whole thing playing out?
Well, look, I'll try to be brief to allow more time for questions. AUKUS, I'm not, you know, familiar with sort of internal debates inside the government. Simply what I was referring to was the positions of relatively hawkish mainstream commentators who have looking at this as simply a procurement issue and the wisdom of, you know, planning well into the future for a, you know, relatively small number of submarines of that kind. You know, you've lost people like Greg Sheridan, you've lost people like Peter Hartcher. They've all essentially come out against the AUKUS strategy. And in that situation, you'd have to say that there is disquiet in elite foreign policy circles towards the plan. Look, I think that I think that the ALP is, you know, we have to think about the logic of deterrence in this situation, and the trick about deterrence is that everyone wants to look like they're willing to go to war without really wanting to go to war. And I think that, you know, in the best of all possible worlds, from Canberra's point of view, you know, the ideal scenario is one in which Australia just keeps getting rich off selling things to China, safely protected by a wall of American steel. So Australia has to act hawkish in order to convince the Americans that it's, you know, Australia's a reliable deputy to play that role. At the same time, the logic is that once America seems to be playing the role that we want it to play, then Australia can try to back off and possibly revive some of those economic benefits of the relationship. And I think that, you know, I think that dynamic has been quite significantly disrupted by the last 5 years, but it's not entirely gone from the nature of policy making at the moment. So
thanks, David.
This is why we would see contradictions.
Thank you. And now a question to Professor Horne. We leave our Australian guest to have a little rest while we address one or two questions to our Chinese guest. Who would like to ask him a question? Yes, John. Could you come here, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor. I'm just wondering whether you see where there might be any opportunities for cooperation between Australia and the US, Australia, China, and the US to diffuse possible trouble spots or where we're already engaged. For example, the Korean Peninsula. No one would want a war, nuclear war, or a refugee flow out of Korea. Australia has police in the Solomon Islands, and China is wanting to put police in there. is there to strengthen their capacity, their local capacity? Is there any chance of cooperation on something like that? Back in the 80s, there was the nuclear-free and independent Pacific idea. At the moment, we're moving in the opposite direction. There seems to be bilateral rivalry, and the US have just signed agreements with different Pacific countries. China's wanting to do the same. Whereas if they were independent or some way of diffusing it and providing aid through a neutral body like the UNDP, Development Program of the UN or something, rather than competing with each other, whether there's any likely openness on anything like that, yeah, maybe that's enough. Any type of ideas of cooperative areas and UN visits to different countries. We've got people coming, the anti-torture people, to our detention centres. You've got the vegans. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your question. I think actually, on the part of China, there's always an openness and willingness to work with any party in the world towards possible collaboration and cooperation. For example, in the Pacific Island countries, China has always been indicating very clearly that China does not exclude possible collaboration with any third-party countries in Solomon Islands, in PNG, in other countries. When the United States and also Australia is having, the aid programs and also joint ventures and business activities, China is not opposed to that. China never says, China should be the Pacific Island countries' partner of choice or the prioritized, partner. That has never been, the attitude for China. So the same actually applies to elsewhere in the world. For example, like in as I just mentioned, for example, the Australia-Japan reciprocal access agreements. China never really, opposed to that, because as two sovereign countries, the two countries have all the rights to collaborate with each other in various issues. So I think actually no interference and also respect of the sovereignty and self-determination. That's actually very important to ensure the international order. That's one thing. So as for the Korean Peninsula, I think actually China is obviously one of the stakeholders in that region, and China has got this long-standing collaboration with North Korea. So I think actually China will be actually playing an active role. China doesn't want, for example, on China's doorstep to have a war, nuclear war, or whatever war that is taking place, that is likely to take place. That certainly is actually definitely not to in China's interest. So definitely China is willing to work with any party of interest to ensure the peace and stability in its neighboring areas. That's one thing. Other areas, for example, like climate change and other issues, those are actually all areas which China is willing to work with other countries, with Australia, with Europe, with the United States. So I think actually the most important thing is actually not to stifle and to hinder China developments, because actually you can never really, as people often say about containment of China, China cannot be contained. China cannot be stopped in its pathway towards development and economic development, and also people's livelihood, improvement of people's livelihood. So if actually the United States is willing to accept that reality, then of course we can all work towards a better future together. Yeah.
Well, that might be a fitting end. I know there are more questions, but time has beaten us. And I want to express my thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts on one of the most important issues of the day. Of course, China-Australia of particular concern to Australia and to China, but it raises larger questions about China and the West more generally. And one can only hope that things will get better rather than worse, and perhaps act towards that. Thank you both for your contributions, ongoing contributions around these issues, and for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us this afternoon in Australia, and I think now afternoon in China, in East China as well. So thank you to both.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's been a pleasure. Thank you,
Thank
Channel.
you.
Thank you to the audience.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Hope
Thank
to
you.
see you again in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
We kept Ben very busy today. Now, Ben, when you go back to your table, could you tell me if Professor Chen Hong is still there? I don't particularly want him to be there. I'm just asking. No? No. Okay. So that was a very interesting discussion because it raised a number of the difficulties. Professor Chen Hong didn't want me to make a song and dance about it, but I'm going to mention it, and I don't think he'll be too upset. You may not know, he is, in my view, without doubt, Australia's best Chinese ambassador in China. But in its wisdom, the Morrison government denied him a visa in, I think, about nearly 2 years ago. And I'm not sure that there has been any shift on that, but perhaps there will be. He has been to Australia umpteen times until the last year or two, and that was the meaning behind him saying he hopefully anticipates the possibility of visiting Australia in the near future. That was the subtext, okay? So we couldn't have had him physically present even if he wanted to. So that's worth remembering. Okay, now, just a few little things by way of closing the afternoon. I'm sorry you've had to put up with so much input, but I want to raise a few projects which are in the making, which will give much more by way of opportunities for conversation. Some of you will know, and some of you are involved. Conversation at the Crossroads has established a number of, has a project called Conversations That Matter, and several groups have got off the ground, small groups of anywhere between 4, 5 or up to 10. And unfortunately, the person who is taking charge of that project wasn't able to be with us. Otherwise, I would have called upon him to say a few words by way of background. We are hoping to take this project a step further over the next 12 months and so. So you should expect to hear from us, whether any of you have an interest in being part of a group, or even if you're interested in forming a group. This opportunity will come, I think, by way of a message that will be sent around before the end of the year. In addition to that, we're thinking of a number of other possibilities, including, and I'll only mention 3, that's enough, big ideas in the pub, which obviously can only be, well, it can be online, but it'll be primarily an in-person event. And I think Christian will be doing something about that in time for early next year. We also have the idea of politics in the park. And I think Susan is going to work on this. And again, we're thinking of something in the early part of next year when summer is still with us, or at least it's still very warm weather. In addition, we are thinking, now this is a bit ambitious, of a series of lunchtime talks, which will happen, we would like to think, in Melbourne and Sydney simultaneously, but in touch with each other. In other words, there'll be one program, one event. Let's assume there are 2 speakers, brief lunchtime in the city, Melbourne and Sydney, with a moderator and a speaker in Sydney and a moderator and a speaker here, both meeting physically, but also connecting with each other online. So we're hoping that this might get off the ground, if not by the end of this year, then again early next year. So there are possibilities, and we hope you will be able to spread the word, and not just in terms of your own possible involvement. This is an invitation. Now, I'm going to mention one other thing before we close. Nothing to do with conversation at the Crossroads. But because I have an interest in it, I thought you might be interested if I bring it to your attention. Because of the seriousness of the situation in relation to both Europe, the conflict in Ukraine is just the tip of the iceberg, and the tensions around Taiwan, China, US, Australia, we thought it would be appropriate, three of us, to try and state a position as to where we're at and where we might ideally be heading. And we've set up, this is the call, it's a call, we're not, although Change.org only knows the word petition, it's not a petition, it's a call to all who care about humanities and the planet's future. And if you'd just like to scroll down a little bit, past the statement, which you can read at your leisure, we'll send you the link. It was prepared by the three of us. And I mean, Professor Richard Falk is really a bit of a legend. At the age of 92, he still puts in 50 to 60 hours a week, no break, all right? So, and then we have sought endorsements by reasonably well-known people, and we just scroll down a bit leisurely. Some of the names you will recognize if we could keep going down. You probably at least have heard of Jeffrey Sachs, perhaps, John Pilger, Jeremy Corbyn, and for those of you who keep going, Kishore Mahbubani, we saw on the 7-week series, and then if we keep going down, keep going down, and Yanis Varoufakis, whom we had the pleasure to be, he was our guest at the 7-week series. Okay, and some 2,000 people have since endorsed it. Now, this is just the first step. It will be followed, I expect, by an international webinar Thursday week. But I don't expect too many of you will be joining it live because we have to worry about time zones, and Australia is at the edge, as you know. So to accommodate Europe, Asia, and the Americas, it'll be on at 11 p.m. Australian time. But for night owls, no problem. And there'll be a recording. So international webinar, there'll be about 5 people speaking with, we expect, a nice cross-section of people across all continents. That's just an initial step to be followed by more developments, particularly by way of some physical gatherings happening in different parts of the world, primarily Europe and Asia, but also the Americas, and hopefully in Australia. That might happen towards the end of this year or early next year. So just stay tuned. You will begin to get some information from this, and there will be much more information forthcoming over the next few weeks. By the way, we have already sent this with some more specific requests to the UN Secretary General and to the Russian, American, French, Chinese, UK, and some other leaders, including Turkey, South Africa, and Indonesia. Pope Francis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Islamic leaders, and a few others. So we don't hold our breath, particularly of the political leaders, that they will be replying anytime soon, but at least we have made the gesture. That we've given them an opportunity. Okay, any questions about anything? Oh, yes.
Will the webinar be recorded for
Yes.
those of us who can't stay up?
Yes, it will be. It will be. And we hope there will be a website soon, and the recording, presumably the link will appear on the website somehow. But that takes a little bit of time. But the recording will be available a day or two after the event. Anything at all that anyone wants to raise? Yes.
Terrible time to raise it, but is our innate racism the basis of our mistrust of China?
Did everyone hear that? Well, I think is, for those who may not have heard, is our innate racism one of the important factors behind? Yes, I think we have never let go. And I think I did mention that Australia, or at least Australian elites, have tended to think of Australia as a European outpost. They are overwhelmingly European. There are very few, I don't know that there are any Indigenous members of our elites, meaning security, strategic, that kind of area, and very, very few non-Anglo-European. So it's a mindset. It's a mindset that sees friends being far away and potential enemies very close by. And that leads to the kind of insurance policy that Australian governments have committed themselves to ever since European settlement. Namely, that you support and fight the wars of the European or American power. That's the premium you pay. And the insurance policy, we are told, is that Australian security is protected. So we fight in World War I, World War II, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, the Boer War, etc., etc. But always on the side of either Britain or the United States. And there is a racial dimension. Whether or not the elite itself is committed to a racial view is irrelevant. It thinks it can appeal to that streak in the Australian population.
Joe, you asked for a further comment.
Yes.
I just wanted to draw everybody's attention to the fact that an organisation called the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition successfully published an appeal in the Saturday paper and also the Weekend Australian. It has over 1,000 individual signatories and 90 organisations, trade unions and other organisations that have signed up to it. It is still open on the Anti-AUKUS Coalition.org website and still seeking signatures from anyone who has misgivings about AUKUS and where it is taking us.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, one more. Yes.
Oh,
Online. Yes, please.
oh. Julie speaking, is that all right? I just want to thank you, Joe, for having this. I've really enjoyed it. But I really admire the patience and the calmness of the Chinese people, given all that's gone on the last couple of years during the pandemic, the AUKUS. And I didn't know whether it was the right thing to do, but I did hold up this. I live in a tiny little country town, about 1,300 people. And I went to the nearby town and got these T-shirts made. I've only got about 8 or so, and I'm doing it gradually each week as I sell them to get it out there on the street that we don't want AUKUS. We don't want nuclear submarines. We were railroaded into it undemocratically.
Well done. The visual part is very good.
Oh, that was all right. I thought it was a bit rude when I put it up before, but then I thought I had to do it. It's an activist.
Okay. You've done it. Okay. All right. Any more?
Joe, I've got
last one. People.
I just want to add on to that racism issue that we discussed. personally, I feel that racism is a second issue. The most important issue is power. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. We all know that. And racism happens even war happens among the same people. I mean, we kill ourselves, you know, whether it's German, whether it's Chinese, whether it's European, whether it's Islamic. So the racism is not the main point. The racism, unfortunately, is the collateral damage for some people. But it's the power we want to, what we call restrict the power of all the leaders, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in China, whether it's in the UN or Canada. You know, but we need UN to make sure that we have the power to control military power like US and China and Russia. Otherwise, we have no way of controlling them. The history has shown us we have to learn from history. But unfortunately, human being hasn't learned it yet. Within ourselves, within Australia, within the United States, within a civilized European country, we've done that. We have done that. We have stopped our own people from becoming dictatorial, from misusing the power. But on the international stage, we still cannot do it.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not so confident that we have done it. Not so confident. I think we've got a long way to go, all of us, but we can make a difference. So thank you everyone for coming, for your patience. And thank you to Ben for all the work. And to all those who have helped. And hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you, Joe.